Hello, weary traveler. Before we step into the biting winds and snowbound fields of the medieval world, let me welcome you to this quiet corner of history. Perhaps you are curled beneath a blanket, drifting towards sleep, or simply seeking the comfort of a story that carries you far away from the noise of the present day. Wherever you are, whatever time the clock reads, as you press play, you and I are about to walk together into another age. I invite you to leave a small trace of yourself behind, a comment telling me where in the world you listen from. It has always amazed me how this community of listeners forms a kind of modern hearth fire where strangers gather across oceans and continents to share in the flickering light of the past. If you enjoy being carried away into these calm, immersive tales, know there are many more ahead, so linger a while, subscribe, and keep this circle of history unbroken. But for tonight, let us set aside the comforts of heated rooms, steaming cups, and electric lamps. Let us step back past centuries of invention and insulation into a world where winter was not a season of inconvenience, but of mortal peril. Imagine it now, the landscape of medieval Europe as autumn's last warmth slips away. Trees stand bare, their skeletal branches rattling against a pale sky. The sun hovers low, casting long, cold shadows across stubbled fields. The earth itself seems to hold its breath. Beneath your boots, the soil crunches with frost, and from the north comes a wind sharp as a blade. It smells faintly of smoke from distant hearths, thin threads of warmth fighting to hold their ground against the encroaching dark. Winter is coming. For us, those words might conjure inconveniences, icy sidewalks, heavy coats, perhaps a heating bill higher than we'd like. But for men and women of the Middle Ages, winter meant something far more elemental. It meant hunger gnawing long before the first snow fell. It meant sickness thriving in smoky, unventilated cottages. It meant a battle for survival that began not with the blizzard, but with the harvest months earlier. Because if the stores were too lean, the coming cold promised misery and possibly death. In this age, there were no thick glass windows to keep out the wind, no padded coats stuffed with down feathers, no central furnace humming steadily through the night. Even the wealthy lived in stone halls that drank in the cold, seeping chill into every chamber. The poor, who were the majority, dwelled in huts barely more than mud and timber, roofs patched with straw, smoke filling the air until eyes watered and lungs ached. To wake in such a place on a winter morning was to rise with your breath already fogging before your face, your fingers numb before you'd even touch the icy latch of the door. And yet it had not always been this way. Centuries earlier, the rhythm of the seasons had been more forgiving, winters less brutal. Fields recovered, rivers flowed freely, and men accepted the cold as they accepted the rain or the sun, an ordinary part of life. But as the Middle Ages wore on, something shifted. The climate itself seemed to turn against mankind, tightening its grip year after year. By the 14th century, Europe was sliding into what would later be called the Little Ice Age, a long era of bitter cold that stretched on for centuries. But before we plunge into that history, let us remain here, on the threshold of a medieval winter. Picture a small village on the edge of the forest. The last apples have been plucked, their withered skins shriveling in baskets. The final sheaves of grain are tucked away in the Lord's granary, and the peasants' own meager stores are hidden in earthen crocks and wooden chests. In the distance, smoke trails from a manor hall where servants hurry to preserve salted meat and casks of ale. The air hums with a tension that all can feel. Children play in the frost, but glance nervously at the darkening woods. Mothers count loaves and dried beans. fathers stack firewood as though each log might stand between life and death. The people know what is coming because they have seen it all before. The snow that seals roads and locks villages away from one another. The hunger that sets in when stored grain grows moldy, when livestock grows thin, when bellies rumble through long nights. The coughs that begin in November and claim lives before March. This is not a romantic winter of jingling bells and warm scarves. This is winter as it truly was, a gaunt, merciless season that demanded endurance of body and spirit alike. And so, dear listener, our journey begins, not with kings or battles or monuments, but with the simple truth of survival. The peasant huddling beneath a blanket of straw, the noble pacing the drafty corridors of a castle, the monk scratching prayers on a page by the flicker of a rushlight. All of them were united in dread as the first icy breath of winter swept across the land. Tonight, we will walk beside them. We will feel their fear, their hunger, their stubborn hope. And perhaps by the end, we will see our own winters with new eyes. Long before the dreadful winters of the late Middle Ages, Europe had known gentler seasons. From roughly the 9th to the 13th centuries, a period historians call the medieval warm period. Fields ripened with ease, vineyards flourished as far north as England, and harvests came in such abundance that Europe's population swelled. Winters still came, of course, but they were endurable, something to be tolerated, not feared. The balance between man and nature, though fragile, seems steady. But climates are not fixed. Just as the sea ebbs and surges, so too do temperatures rise and fall across centuries. By the early 14th century, the pendulum swung sharply toward the cold. Sudden storms lashed the coasts, summers grew shorter, and winters lengthened with a bitter intensity no one could recall in living memory. Crops failed. Rivers froze that had never frozen before. By the time people realized this was no passing fluctuation, an era of hardship had already begun. Later scholars would name it the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long chill that shaped not only landscapes but the course of human history. The causes remain debated even now. Some point to volcanic eruptions which shrouded the skies in ash and dimmed the sun's warmth. Others note a lull in solar activity, a so-called Maunder minimum, when the sun's energy output fell. Shifts in ocean currents and the jet stream may have played their part as well. Whatever the reason, the climate conspired against medieval Europe, and the change was felt in every hut, village, and castle. To understand the fear that crept into people's hearts, imagine being a farmer in northern France in the year 1310. For generations, your family's land had yielded enough grain to feed both kin and lord. But the summers now grow cool and damp. Rain comes in torrents, flattening the barley before it can ripen, while frost nips the wheat in early spring. By autumn, your granary looks bare, and winter has not even arrived. The unease spreads from household to household until the whole village feels the weight of what is coming. The climate shift also unsettled the psychology of the age. Medieval people interpreted weather not as a blind force of nature, but as a reflection of God's will. Gentle winters were signs of divine favor. Savage storms and bitter frosts felt like punishment. Chroniclers wrote of the heavens turning their face from mankind, of sins so grievous that even the earth recoiled. Priests led processions through snowbound streets, hoisting relics in the hope of staving off further calamity. Famine was not only a physical terror, it was a spiritual crisis. And yet, amid this bleakness, there was wonder too. Accounts describe forests sparkling with ice as though the world were encased in glass. Children marveled at frozen rivers where one could walk from bank to bank, an experience their grandparents would scarcely have believed possible. In time, these sites would give rise to festivals and frost fairs, where merchants and jugglers set up stalls directly on the ice. But at the dawn of the Little Ice Age, such marvels were seen less as opportunities for play and more as omens of danger. Europe was not alone in its suffering. Across the world, societies from China to the Andes recorded harsher winters and disrupted harvests. But in the densely populated heart of medieval Europe, where survival already hung by a thread, the shift was devastating. Populations that had boomed during the warm centuries now strained the land to breaking point. There was little margin for error, and nature allowed none. The truth is simple and stark. A colder climate meant shorter growing seasons, failed crops, dwindling livestock, and a spiral of hunger that touched every class. Winter was no longer just a season. It became a looming specter, an adversary that shaped the rhythm of life and death for generations. As the Little Ice Age deepened, chroniclers began to speak of winters so harsh they seemed biblical. Ice sealing harbors, trapping ships until they splintered, wolves descending from forests to stalk villages, bells freezing in church towers, their clappers stuck fast, as though even sound itself were silenced by the cold. For those who lived through it, this was not weather. It was warfare waged by nature against mankind. And it is here, in this new, colder world, that our story of medieval winter truly begins. For the chill was not just in the air, it was in the soul of Europe itself, reshaping how men and women thought, prayed, worked, and endured. The chronicles of medieval Europe are filled with descriptions of winters so savage they seemed torn from myth. Among them, none is remembered with such awe and terror as the Great Frost of 1709. Though technically beyond the medieval period, it was the culmination of the same climatic cycle that had plagued Europe for centuries, a frozen monument to the power of the Little Ice Age. That January, the cold descended with a ferocity that stunned even those accustomed to hard winters. In France, temperatures plunged so low that birds froze mid-flight and tumbled from the sky like stones. Vineyards, the lifeblood of the countryside, withered into blackened skeletons. Wells froze solid. Water drawn into pails turned instantly to ice. The Seine and the Thames, mighty rivers that usually shrugged off frost, hardened into glistening highways of ice. Londoners, never ones to waste an opportunity, turned the frozen Thames into a surreal carnival. Merchants erected stalls on the ice. Butchers laid out their cuts of meat. Booksellers displayed their wares, and innkeepers poured steaming cups of mulled wine. Whole streets of commerce sprang up where ships would normally pass. Bonfires roared on the frozen surface, and oxen were roasted whole as crowds gathered in wonder. It was called a frost fair, a festival born of calamity, where laughter and commerce masked the silent truth. Beyond the fairground merriment, countless poor huddled in hovels, starving or freezing to death. The winter of 1709 was the deadliest in recorded European history. In France alone, nearly 500,000 people perished. Fields lay barren. Livestock died by the thousands, and even the wealthy could not escape the chill that crept through castle walls. And yet such legendary frosts did not only bring death, they sometimes brought strange, unintended gifts. Take the young Isaac Newton, who as a student at Cambridge had his studies disrupted when a great frost forced the university to close its doors. Returning to his family's farm, Newton found himself with endless hours of solitude. By the hearth, staring into the flames while snow howled outside, he began to wrestle with the great mysteries of the cosmos. In that quiet exile, he developed the foundations of calculus and optics, ideas that would reshape science forever. Thus, from the silence of a frozen winter, a new universe was born. Newton was not alone. Many thinkers, artists, and chroniclers found that winter forced them inward, into contemplation. The long, dark nights gave rise to poetry, music, and innovations that may never have emerged in gentler seasons. It is tempting to wonder how much of Europe's cultural richness was forged not in comfort but in cold. Still, for most, there was no such silver lining. Imagine the year 1434, when chroniclers in the Low Countries wrote of rivers frozen solid for months, ships trapped in ice like flies in amber. Bread prices soared until only the wealthy could afford it. In Florence, even the olive trees, symbols of resilience in the Mediterranean, cracked under the frost. One monk wrote bitterly that God has turned his face from us, and the earth is hard as iron. These legendary winters were not confined to one place. Across Europe, from the fjords of Norway to the vineyards of Spain, the cold reached its skeletal fingers. The Baltic Sea froze so thoroughly that travelers crossed from Poland to Sweden on foot. Wolves, driven from forests by hunger, stalked the streets of French villages, their howls blending with the wind. In some regions, parents kept children indoors, not just against the cold, but against prowling beasts. And yet amid this terror, the human instinct for wonder remained. Children skated on ice with bone skates strapped to their boots. Couples carved initials into frozen rivers. Painters, inspired by these scenes, captured them in the luminous canvases of the Dutch Golden Age. Images of skaters gliding beneath low winter suns, of market stalls set against snowy horizons. Art immortalized what daily life barely endured. The great frosts etched themselves into memory, not only because they killed, but because they transformed the very landscape of society. They revealed mankind's fragility, but also its adaptability. Merchants selling wares on ice, families huddled together against hunger, scholars turning forced solitude into genius. All these became part of Europe's story. But such legendary winters were not extraordinary accidents. They were part of a new reality, a world gripped by harsher seasons, where survival was no longer certain and every winter was a battle. The frost fairs, the frozen rivers, the wolves in the streets, all these were the visible scars of the Little Ice Age. And for those who lived in it, there was no end in sight. When we imagine medieval castles, we tend to picture roaring hearths, laden banquet tables, and nobles wrapped in silks and furs. Yet the truth was far less romantic. Behind the stone walls of those great fortresses, winter was an enemy even kings and queens could not ignore. The very architecture that made castles formidable in war made them dreadful in the cold. Stone walls were thick, yes, but they acted like ice boxes, storing the chill and radiating it inward. Drafts slipped through every arrow slit and crevice, moaning across the halls like restless spirits. Great fireplaces were built wide enough to roast an ox whole, but their heat rarely traveled far. A servant standing 3 paces from the blaze might sweat from the heat on one side and shiver from frost on the other. Keeping such halls livable required astonishing amounts of fuel. Records from the 15th century tell us that a royal household could burn through dozens of wagon loads of firewood every single week in winter. Entire forests groaned under the demands of noble hearths. The logistics of storing, chopping, and transporting so much wood fell on the backs of peasants and servants who trudged through snow with axes and carts, often risking frostbite themselves just to keep their lords warm. And it wasn't only firewood. Kitchens became engines of survival, working ceaselessly to salt meats, preserve vegetables, and keep casks of ale from freezing. Servants wrapped barrels in straw, stacked roots in underground pits, and tended smoky fires that dried fish or smoked bacon. A lapse in preparation could mean hunger, even within the walls of the mighty. Yet for all these efforts, castles remained vulnerable. Chroniclers tell chilling tales, sometimes literally. In one account from Hungary, a queen was found dead in her chambers in the winter of 1326, frozen in her bed, despite layers of furs. In another, King Henry II of England, overcome by a particularly bitter chill, ordered an entire wooden chair burned simply to warm himself for a fleeting moment. His servants despaired, knowing he might order another should his royal temper flare. Royal women suffered especially. The fashionable silks and satins they favored were splendid in courtly display, but useless against the damp cold. Chronicles describe noble ladies pacing drafty halls, with shawls drawn tight, their jewels glittering as breath misted from their lips. Many fell ill during confinement after childbirth, their weakened bodies succumbing to infections worsened by the cold. Queen Jane Seymour, beloved of Henry VIII, is often said to have died in part from such cruel conditions. Even the court's amusements were altered by winter. Grand feasts continued, of course, tables piled with roasted boar, swan, and spiced pies, but beyond the candlelight, guests shivered, their laughter sometimes punctuated by coughs. Musicians' fingers stiffened on lutes and harps, their melodies faltering. Dancers stamped their feet not only for rhythm, but to keep blood flowing. The illusion of warmth was maintained by merriment, yet beyond the hall, the wind rattled shutters and howled like a reminder. No one, not even a king, could command the seasons. And yet within these struggles there was also a curious sense of equality. The poor starved sooner, yes, but cold pierced rich and poor alike. A noble in velvet and ermine still awoke with icy breath fogging above him. A knight armored in steel felt it bite through his gauntlets. In this way, winter was a quiet leveler of society, a reminder that all men and women, no matter their station, were subject to the same unyielding frost. Imagine it, a royal banquet in January. Candles sputter in the draft. Nobles laugh loudly, cups of steaming mulled wine in hand, yet between their jokes they tug furs closer about their shoulders. Down in the servants' quarters, scullions huddle around the kitchen fire, soot on their faces, teeth chattering. Outside, a peasant trudges through the snow, dragging another load of wood for the Lord's hearth. 3 different worlds, but all shivering under the same breath of winter. This was the paradox of castles in the cold. They were symbols of power, yet powerless against nature's simplest weapon, frost. And for all their majesty, they could feel just as inhospitable as the meanest of huts when winter pressed its icy hand against the stones. If life in a castle was cold and drafty, then life in a peasant's cottage was little short of brutal. For the vast majority of medieval people, serfs, farmers, craftsmen, the home was not a fortress of stone, but a hut of wattle and daub, wooden frames packed with mud and straw, roofed with thatch that dripped with meltwater and leaked the smoke of the hearth. Step inside one of these dwellings in the depth of winter, and the first thing you would notice is the smoke. With no chimney, the fire smoldered in an open pit, its fumes escaping only through the thatch or the cracks in the roof. The air inside was thick, stinging the eyes, coating the rafters in soot. Yet without that smoky fire, There was no hope of warmth. The entire family, and often their livestock, shared this single room. Chickens clucked in the corners. Goats or sheep were tethered near the door, and a cow might be stabled just beyond a wooden partition. Their body heat added precious degrees to the room, though it also added smell, a pungent mixture of dung, straw, and damp wool. It was unpleasant, but in the depths of January, survival mattered more than comfort. Beds, if they could be called that, were little more than piles of straw, covered with rough blankets. Parents and children alike huddled together in one heap, pressed close for warmth. A child waking in the night might reach out and feel the ribs of a sibling, the rough wool of a blanket, or the soft flank of a tethered sheep breathing in the dark. It was a closeness born not of choice, but of necessity. Food, too, was a constant worry. By midwinter, the autumn's harvest of beans, grains, and cabbages had dwindled to a few crocks in the corner. Meat was a rarity, reserved for feast days or for those lucky enough to trap a hare or a pigeon. Most meals were pottage, a thin stew of peas, onions, maybe a bit of barley, simmering endlessly in the pot above the fire. It was monotonous, often tasteless, but it filled the belly, and that was all that mattered. Hunger sharpened with every passing week. Mothers quietly gave the larger portions to their children, gnawing at crusts themselves. Fathers rose before dawn to trudge through the snow in search of firewood, their hands cracked and raw, knowing that without it, their families might not survive the night. And always, there was the gnawing uncertainty. Would the stores last until spring? The physical discomfort was constant. Fingers swelled with chilblains, red and itching from cold, toes blistered inside damp boots. Frost crept along the thatch at night, leaving delicate white lace that was beautiful and cruel at once. To wake in such a house was to see your own breath hanging in the dim light, to feel your bones ache with cold before you had even risen from your bed of straw. And yet, for all the hardship, there was resilience. Families told stories around the hearth to pass the long nights. Grandmothers recited saints' lives or folk tales of wolves and spirits in the forest. Children whispered rhymes, their voices rising above the crackle of the fire. These tales were more than amusement. They were a shield, a way of keeping despair at bay when the nights seemed endless. Sometimes even joy found its way in. A loaf of bread shared with neighbors, a jug of ale brewed in the autumn and saved for the coldest night, a birth, a marriage, or simply the first sight of the sun glittering on fresh snow. Such moments were precious, all the more treasured because they shone against the backdrop of such relentless struggle. In truth, the peasants of medieval Europe did not expect comfort. Life was a chain of toil and endurance, but in winter that endurance was tested to its very edge. Survival depended on community, faith, and stubborn willpower. And though countless succumbed, countless more endured, huddled in their hovels, coughing in the smoke, whispering prayers into the frozen night, waiting for the thaw. If cold gnawed at the body, then hunger hollowed it from within. For peasants and nobles alike, the specter of famine haunted every winter, but none more so than during the infamous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It began, as so many disasters do, with the weather. Rains swept across Europe in spring and summer, relentless and cold. Seeds rotted in the ground. Grain lay flattened in the fields. Harvest after harvest failed, until the granaries of lords and the cupboards of peasants alike stood nearly bare. By winter, desperation reigned. Chroniclers describe villagers pulling bark from trees, boiling it into bitter meals. Others scavenged for nettles and roots beneath the snow, or ate whatever scraps could be found. Cats, dogs, even rats. In some regions, famine stories took on darker shades, whispered rumors of parents smothering children to spare them the agony of slow starvation, or of corpses dug from graves and consumed. Whether all of these accounts are true or not, they reveal the depths of terror felt by those who lived through it. The famine was not confined to one corner of Europe. From Ireland to Poland, the suffering spread like a plague of hunger. In towns, bread prices soared 20-fold. A single loaf could cost more than a laborer's daily wage, forcing families to choose between food and the smallest comforts of life. Markets, once bustling, turned into places of anguish. Chronicles speak of mothers clutching coins in trembling hands, weeping as bakers turned them away. The powerful fared better, but they were not immune. Lords who once feasted on venison and swan now rationed salted pork, while their servants gnawed on scraps. Even monasteries, usually havens of charity, grew strained. Monks who gave bread to the poor sometimes left their own tables empty. The famine forced a grim reckoning. Survival often meant choosing between compassion and self-preservation. What made hunger in winter so cruel was its inescapability. Fields lay frozen and useless. Game was scarce, driven deep into the forests. Fishing holes iced over. Every path toward sustenance seemed barred. Unlike summer scarcity, winter famine offered no chance of reprieve until spring's planting, and even then, months would pass before the harvest could be reaped. Malnutrition weakened the body, making people easy prey for disease. Children's bellies swelled, their limbs withered. The elderly succumbed quickly, slipping away in sleep. The strong grew gaunt, their faces hollow, their eyes dulled with despair. Villages recorded whole families vanishing over the course of a single winter, their huts silent but for the wind. And famine bred unrest. Hungry men are dangerous men, and throughout Europe, thefts and riots flared. Bands of starving peasants roamed the countryside, raiding storehouses and attacking travelers. In some cities, authorities executed looters in public squares, a cruel spectacle meant to terrify the starving into submission. But hunger is not easily cowed. For every thief who swung from a gallows, 10 more took his place, driven by the same gnawing emptiness. The Great Famine of 1315 to 17 claimed millions of lives, its death toll rivaling even the later plague. But winter hunger was not confined to these infamous years. It was a constant threat, a familiar shadow. Every household counted its sacks of grain. Every mother measured each crust of bread, knowing that miscalculation could mean death before the thaw. To us, hunger is often an inconvenience, a skipped meal, or an empty pantry solved with a trip to the market. But to the medieval poor, hunger was a season. It arrived with the snows, lingered through the dark months, and left behind not only graves, but scars in memory. For those who survived, each mouthful of spring's fresh greenery must have tasted like salvation itself. Hunger was not winter's only weapon. In the smoke-filled cottages, in the drafty chambers of castles, disease thrived. Cold itself did not cause sickness, but it weakened bodies, thinned resistance, and turned every cough into a threat. In medieval Europe, winter was the season when illness came stalking. Influenza was among the most feared. It swept through villages like wildfire, leaving behind fevers, chills, and aching limbs. Without medicine or vaccines, flu outbreaks often killed not dozens but thousands. The winter of 1557 was especially cruel. An epidemic raged across Europe, striking rich and poor alike. In Paris alone, chroniclers counted more than 10,000 dead. Families that had survived famine now found themselves undone by sickness. Pneumonia, too, was a silent killer. Cold, damp air seeped into lungs already weakened by malnutrition. Villagers described it as the drowning disease, for it filled the chest with fluid until every breath rattled and gurgled. Entire families sometimes succumbed in quick succession, leaving cottages empty, their fires cold. Nor were the castles safe. The flow of servants, visitors, and petitioners carried contagion from hall to hall. In such close quarters, disease spread quickly, and luxury offered little defense. Even queens and kings trembled when fevers struck. Henry VIII lost his beloved Jane Seymour, not only to the perils of childbirth, but to the infections that found easy purchase in winter's chill. Children were the most vulnerable. Born into cold months, many never drew more than a handful of breaths. In London during the 1500s, half of all children died before reaching 5 years of age, with winter months claiming the most. One heartbreaking custom revealed the grim familiarity with infant death. Mothers tied small black ribbons called bone lace around the wrists of their sickest babies. If the child died, that ribbon was used to fasten their burial shroud. For many mothers, it was a ribbon they prayed never to need, yet always kept ready. Disease during winter was not limited to influenza and pneumonia. Dysentery, spread by contaminated water, cut through families huddled indoors. Tuberculosis, known as the White Plague, wasted away countless lives, its sufferers coughing blood into the snow. In some winters, even leprosy spread faster, as weakened immune systems fell prey to contagion. And then, of course, there was the Great Terror, the plague. The Black Death of the 14th century did not spare winter months. Malnourished, shivering populations proved especially vulnerable, their bodies too weak to resist. In towns across Europe, mass graves were dug into frozen ground, priests murmuring prayers as cart after cart of corpses was heaved into the earth. The cold preserved the dead, delaying decay but not the grief. Imagine the sound of winter illness in a peasant hovel, the coughs of a father echoing through the smoky dark, the wheezing of a child, the whispered prayers of a mother pressing her hand to a fevered brow. Outside, the snow falls silently, indifferent to the lives being snuffed out within. In the monasteries, monks took on the grim work of tending the sick. Brother William, a young novice in one such cloister, recorded the stench of infected wounds, the cries of those gasping for breath, and his own horror as he prayed for strength. For the monks, it was a duty of faith. For the peasants, a desperate hope. For all, winter sickness was a shadow that seemed to lengthen with every icy dawn. This was the cruel rhythm of the season. Hunger weakened the body, and disease finished what famine began. Together, they made winter more than a chill. It was a season of death, an adversary from which no rank or robe could shield mankind. In the medieval countryside, humans did not endure winter alone. Their survival was bound tightly to the creatures they raised, the oxen that pulled plows, the cows that gave milk, the sheep that offered wool, the chickens whose eggs were a rare winter blessing. When winter tightened its grip, these animals suffered just as much as their masters. Step into a peasant hovel in January, and you would find not only a family huddled together, but their livestock as well. Goats and chickens were brought indoors, tethered near the hearth to steal what warmth they could. A cow might stand just beyond a crude partition, her steaming breath mingling with the smoke of the fire. The mingling of man and beast was not a matter of affection, it was survival. Animals shared their body heat, and in turn, the family guarded them as they would treasure. For without them, spring promised only ruin. Yet the struggle was evident in every bony flank and hollowed rib. Cows that had grazed lazily on summer's grass now shivered, their hides rimed with frost. Horses grew gaunt on meager feed, their hooves cracked by ice. Draft oxen, beasts of immense strength in warmer months, stood listless in their stalls, their energy spent just to endure the cold. Medieval manuscripts speak of whole herds perishing in harsh winters, leaving villages bereft of both food and the power to work their fields come spring. For peasants, each animal's life was precious. A single cow meant milk for children and butter to sell. A sheep meant wool for spinning, a lamb to slaughter when hunger grew dire. To lose them was to lose not only livelihood, but hope itself. And so in the dead of winter, families fed their animals before themselves, offering the last sheaves of hay even as their own bellies went empty. But animals were not only victims, they were also symbols. In medieval imagination, winter beasts carried meanings beyond their flesh. The wolf, lean and desperate, became the very emblem of hunger. Chroniclers tell of wolf packs slinking into villages, bold enough to snatch children from doorways. Their howls through snowbound forests were omens of death, blending with the moan of the wind. At the same time, the ox or horse, steady even in hardship, embodied endurance, the virtue every peasant aspired to through the long months of cold. Even small creatures found a place in the winter story. Cats, half wild, prowled barns in search of mice, their survival entwined with the family's grain supply. Dogs slept beside their masters, guardians of hearth and flock alike. Their loyalty was a quiet comfort in the howling dark. The bond between human and animal deepened in these months. A farmer stroking the muzzle of his weary ox, whispering encouragement as frost coated its whiskers. A child curling against the warmth of a dog while the fire smoldered low. A mother thanking God for a hen's egg, a fragile sunburst of nourishment against the bleakness of winter. These were not sentimentalities, they were lifelines. Winter reminded medieval people of a truth we often forget. Survival was communal, not only among neighbors, but among every living being under the same roof. In those cold, smoky huts, man and beast endured together, sharing breath, warmth, and the will to live until the thaw returned. Cold and hunger were relentless companions of winter, but they were not its only terrors. The season brought with it disasters that could devastate entire towns in a single night. Fires, floods, and storms, each made deadlier by the bitter cold. Ironically, the very fires that kept people alive so often betrayed them. In villages where homes were built of timber and thatch, one spark from a hearth could reduce half a town to ashes. Imagine it, families huddled around their only source of warmth, smoke curling through the rafters, when a gust of wind carries an ember into the dry straw overhead. In moments, flames roar upward, leaping from roof to roof. In 1212, a fire in London did just that. It swept through the city's narrow lanes with such ferocity that thousands perished, some trapped in their homes, others drowning as they tried to escape across the burning bridge. Winter made the catastrophe worse. Frozen water pipes could not quench the blaze, and survivors shivered in the snow, homeless in the very season when shelter meant survival. If fire devoured towns from within, floods came from without. The North Sea, in particular, was a merciless foe. In 1219, a storm surge known as the Saint Marcellus flood crashed against the lowlands of the Netherlands, killing more than 50,000 people in a single night. Imagine the scene. Villagers clutching children as icy water tore through homes, livestock swept away, church bells tolling wildly before steeples collapsed into the churning sea. Survivors climbed to rooftops only to be stranded until cold claimed them. Chroniclers wrote that entire parishes vanished, leaving behind nothing but scattered timbers and corpses tangled in reeds. Even inland floods were a constant peril. In 1099, England suffered a flood so vast that chroniclers swore no one alive had ever seen its like. Towns were drowned, fields ruined, and countless lives lost. Winter rains turned rivers into beasts, their swollen waters smashing bridges and carrying away barns and mills. For a peasant, such a flood meant not only immediate destruction, but also the certainty of famine when spring came, and the fields lay ruined beneath silt and mud. And then there were the storms. Medieval winters knew gales that howled like demons. Chroniclers described winds so fierce that trees were torn up by their roots and entire thatched villages flattened. For coastal towns, storms brought not only wind, but waves like walls, smashing ships against rocks, scattering bodies and wreckage across the shore. One such storm in 1362 became known as the Great Drowning, or Groot Mandrenki in the Low Countries, a tempest that obliterated ports, drowned thousands, and redrew the very map of Europe's coastline. To medieval people, these disasters were more than natural events. They were divine judgments. Priests declared that floods came as punishment for sin, that fires were warnings, that storms were God's anger made manifest. Processions were held through snow and rain, relics raised high in hopes of appeasing the heavens. When disasters struck, survivors often turned first not to rebuilding, but to prayer, seeking mercy from the unseen hand they believed commanded the elements. But whether divine or natural, the effect was the same: terror, ruin, and despair. Fire stole shelter, flood stole land, storm stole life. In the midst of winter, when even survival was precarious, such disasters turned hardship into apocalypse, and yet even here resilience flickered. After the London fire, townspeople rebuilt with stone. After floods, they reclaimed land with dikes and canals. After storms, they buried their dead and raised new churches. Winter disasters may have broken bodies and villages, but they could not fully break the will of the people. If winter was a season of hunger and death, it was also a season of ritual, moments of light and laughter flaring against the darkness. The church, ever attuned to the needs of the soul, filled the bleak calendar with feasts and holy days, weaving strands of hope into the cold tapestry of survival. And for a brief time each year, the rigid rules of medieval life bent, even broke, in the strange carnival of misrule. At the heart of midwinter was Christmas, celebrated with solemnity and joy. For most, the feast was not about lavish gifts, but about respite, a table set with what little could be spared, a loaf of white bread instead of coarse rye, a cup of ale passed from hand to hand. The Nativity was reenacted in humble churches, candles flickering as choirs sang hymns that echoed through rafters thick with frost. For peasants, these services were a reminder that even the Son of God was born in a stable, swaddled against the cold, sharing space with beasts, themes that mirrored their own lives. But the day after Christmas, on St. Stephen's Day, joy took on a wilder, more subversive form. Across much of Europe, villages crowned a lord of misrule, often a peasant or servant who for a single day held the power to mock and command his betters. Imagine the scene: a ragged man seated in mock regalia, issuing absurd decrees to lords and ladies who were bound by custom to obey. Jesters cavorted, minstrels played bawdy songs, and villagers paraded through snow-slick streets, their laughter ringing louder than the church bells. The rituals of misrule were not mere entertainments. They served as a vital release valve for the pressure of feudal life. For one brief day, the grinding inequalities of medieval society inverted, giving the lowliest peasant a taste of authority and the proudest noble the chance, however unwilling, to be humbled. It was dangerous in the spirit, but tolerated, even blessed, because it kept resentment from festering too deeply. A day of chaos ensured the year of order that followed. Feasting accompanied these rituals, even in times of scarcity. A noble household might slaughter a boar, its head borne into the hall with pomp and song. Villagers might pool what stores they had, cabbages, onions, dried beans, into a communal pot, transforming poverty into fellowship. Ale and mead flowed more freely than at any other time of year, warming bellies and loosening tongues. Fires blazed in great halls and village squares alike, a symbol of defiance against the winter's chill. And the merriment was not confined to food and drink. There were games, dice rattling across wooden tables, children chasing each other through icy lanes, couples sneaking kisses beneath sprigs of holly. There were songs, some sacred, others raucous, echoing the rhythm of life itself, sorrow and joy, hunger and feast, death and rebirth. These rituals carried a deeper weight than their laughter suggested. In celebrating together, communities reinforced the bonds that would carry them through the lean months ahead. Sharing food, even in small amounts, reminded neighbors that survival was collective, not individual. The mockery of misrule reminded peasants and lords alike that the world could be turned upside down and then righted again. So when you picture medieval winter, do not imagine only the frostbitten fields and hollowed faces. Picture also the glow of torchlight on snow, the ring of laughter in a drafty hall, the crowned peasant shouting nonsense decrees as nobles bow with forced smiles. In the harshest of seasons, joy was not merely an indulgence. It was a weapon, wielded against despair. Winter in the Middle Ages was merciless, but it was not born alone. If there was one force that rivaled cold and hunger, it was community. In villages, towns, and even among the scattered farmsteads, survival often depended not on strength or wealth, but on the willingness of neighbors to share what little they had. Picture a village huddled against the snow, smoke curling thinly from thatched roofs. In one cottage, a family's larder is nearly bare. Just a crock of beans and a heel of bread remain. Yet when word spreads that the widow Agnes has no firewood and her children shiver in the dark, a young man trudges through the snow with an armful of logs. Another neighbor ladles out half her pottage into a clay bowl and carries it across the lane. Each gift is small, but in a season when one meal could mean the difference between life and death, it is salvation. Such acts of compassion were not rare. They were expected. Medieval people lived close to the edge, and they knew that the misfortune of one family today could be theirs tomorrow. Cooperation was a kind of insurance binding the village together. Men banded together to mend the roof of a neighbor's cottage after a storm, or to butcher a pig and share the meat among households. Women spun wool communally, their chatter and songs weaving warmth into the long nights. The church encouraged such generosity, preaching the corporal works of mercy, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless. Monasteries became lifelines in winter, offering bread, ale, and even straw beds to the destitute. In return, the poor gave prayers for their benefactors, creating a spiritual economy of compassion. Some nobles, too, embraced their duty, Chronicles tell of Lady Margaret of York selling her jewels to buy grain for the starving, or of lords opening their granaries in times of famine, both out of piety and a keen sense that desperate peasants made dangerous subjects. But compassion did not always take the form of grand gestures. Sometimes it was as simple as company. Families gathered in each other's homes to tell stories, share songs, and ease the weight of the endless nights. Children played games by firelight, their laughter momentarily banishing the moan of the wind outside. Even when food was scarce, warmth of spirit was abundant, yet there was also tension. Scarcity could strain even the strongest bonds. A neighbor who hoarded too much grain might find his barn mysteriously emptied by hungry hands. In some towns, fights broke out in bread lines, desperation turning ally into rival. Still, for every act of theft or jealousy, there were countless more of charity. For many, generosity was not only a moral duty, but a survival strategy. Today you gave, tomorrow you received. Medieval winter, then, was more than a test of the body. It was a test of the soul. The season stripped life to its barest essentials, and in that bareness, people turned to one another. Compassion became as vital as firewood, fellowship as nourishing as bread. Without it, winter would have crushed not only their bodies, but their spirits. So when we think of those frozen months long past, we must imagine not only the suffering, but also the solidarity, the shared meals, the quiet kindnesses, the hands extended in the snow. For though the cold was unrelenting, it was human warmth that carried them through. When the days grew short and the nights stretched long, medieval life narrowed to the circle of firelight. With fields frozen and travel dangerous, families turned inward. Work did not vanish. Wool had to be spun, tools mended, and food prepared. But beyond the labor came something else, the ancient art of storytelling. Picture it, a single smoky hearth glowing in the corner of a cottage. Around it, a family huddles close, their breath misting in the frigid air. Beyond the walls, snow presses in, but inside there is a kind of magic. A grandfather clears his throat and begins a tale, not from a book, for books were rare and precious, but from memory, carried down through generations. Perhaps it is a saint's life, meant to inspire virtue. Perhaps a folk story of clever foxes, wandering ghosts, or heroic knights. The children listen wide-eyed, the rhythm of his voice carrying them far from hunger and cold, into a world where even the poorest peasant could be a king for an evening. Songs, too, filled the nights. Some were sacred hymns, praising God through the dark season. Others were bawdy tavern tunes, or playful rhymes invented by children. Music was more than entertainment. It was a bulwark against despair. The clapping of hands, the beat of a drum, or the scraping of a fiddle could lift spirits higher than a roaring fire. In wealthier homes, leisure took other forms. Nobles gathered in great halls to watch mummers' plays, comic dramas where villagers dressed in masks and costumes acted out crude but funny stories, often poking fun at authority. Dice and card-like games clattered on the tables, fortunes rising and falling in a single throw. Minstrels strummed lutes and sang ballads of distant battles or tragic lovers, their voices echoing in cavernous chambers, while courtiers danced to keep the chill from their bones. Books, for the literate few, were winter treasures. A candle guttering beside a richly painted manuscript could transport its reader from a freezing manor to the courts of King Arthur or the parables of Scripture. But even where literacy was scarce, stories lived in the air, recited, sung, performed. Winter became a season of words, when the imagination did battle with darkness. Even children had their games. They played with carved wooden toys or simple games of knuckle bones, using sheep's ankle bones like dice. Outside, when the snow was thick enough, they slid on frozen ponds with bone skates strapped to their shoes, their laughter carrying across the frost. For them, winter's harshness softened into a playground, at least until hunger called them back indoors. In these ways, medieval people discovered a profound truth. While winter could silence fields and freeze rivers, it could not silence the human voice. Storytelling, song, and play were acts of resistance, defiant affirmations that life and joy persisted even in the darkest months. So imagine the hush of a village in deep January. Snow drifts lie high, wind rattles shutters, but from within the cottages comes the sound of voices, telling tales, singing songs, rolling dice, laughing softly. Against the immensity of winter, they set the warmth of story. And in that warmth, they endured. Winter was not only a season of survival, it was also a season of the heart. With work slowed, nights long, and life pared down to its essentials, people turned to love, to faith, and to reflection. Even in the bitterest months, tenderness and devotion bloomed like fragile flowers in the snow. The church offered the rhythm of prayer to structure these dark days. Agricultural toil might have paused, but spiritual labor never did. Villagers attended Mass more frequently, seeking warmth not just from the fire, but from the company of their neighbors beneath the vaulted rafters of their parish church. The air inside was often as cold as the fields outside, but the flicker of candles, the scent of incense, and the chanting of psalms gave people strength. Fasting and penance were common in winter, when scarcity naturally encouraged restraint. The faithful were reminded that hardship was a path toward humility, and that suffering could be borne with dignity if united with Christ's own. But faith was not the only comfort. Winter also offered rare opportunities for romance. With long evenings to fill, stories and songs often turned to themes of courtship. The feast of St. Valentine, celebrated on February 14th, had by the late Middle Ages already become linked with love and pairing. In some regions, young men and women drew names from a bowl to choose their Valentine for the year, a ritual that often sparked flirtations and sometimes marriages. Gifts were modest, tokens of ribbon, a handmade verse, a sweetmeat, but in the chill of winter, even the smallest gesture burned brightly. Love in winter carried an extra weight, for affection was sharpened by hardship. A husband trudging miles through snow to fetch firewood, a wife saving the last egg for her children, a pair of sweethearts exchanging whispered vows by firelight. These were not grand romances, but quiet testaments to endurance and devotion. Winter was also a time of deep reflection. The stillness of the season invited meditation on life's fragility. The elderly, huddled beneath firs, knew each winter might be their last. Parents prayed over their children, watching them sleep and fearing the cough that could turn deadly overnight. In these moments, many found themselves contemplating eternity. Medieval sermons reminded the faithful that winter itself was a metaphor, the cold sleep of death, to be followed by the eternal spring of resurrection. Yet within this somber frame, there was also hope. Faith assured people that no winter was forever. Love assured them that warmth could be found in human bonds, and reflection allowed them to see meaning in their struggles. Even when the world outside lay frozen, hearts within cottages and castles alike continued to stir with longing, devotion, and hope. In the hush of a February night, when the wind rattled shutters and frost painted the windows, one could hear not only coughs and sighs, but also the murmur of prayers, the laughter of lovers, the rustle of a pen, scratching a love verse. Winter was cruel, but it was also intimate, a season that stripped life to its barest core, and in doing so revealed what mattered most. At last, after months of gnawing cold and endless nights, the world began to change. It was not sudden. Winter clung stubbornly, fighting to keep its hold. But the signs came all the same. A trickle of water beneath the ice, a softening in the ground where frost had once bitten deep, a day when the sun seemed to linger just a moment longer in the sky. For medieval people, these signs were not merely weather, they were miracles. The thaw meant survival. It meant that the stores, however meager, had lasted long enough. It meant that the specter of famine might retreat. Most of all, it meant that the cycle of life, broken and frozen for so long, could begin again. To celebrate this, communities turned to one of the most symbolic festivals of the farming year, Plough Monday. Plough Monday, observed on the first Monday after Epiphany in January, was a ritual of renewal. After the solemnity of Christmas and the brief madness of misrule, it marked the return to work. Yet it was no ordinary labor. Farmers would decorate their plows with ribbons and garlands, sometimes even attaching candles to their frames. In some villages, men blackened their faces with soot, a gesture believed to bring luck, and dragged the plow through the streets in noisy processions. They sang bawdy songs, knocked on doors for coins or food, and carried their plowshare like a sacred relic. The plow itself, often blessed by the priest, became more than a tool. It was a promise. Cutting the first furrow into the thawing soil was a sacred act, a proclamation that life would return to the fields. Villagers followed the plow with prayers and ale, their hearts lightened by the knowledge that spring was on its way. Children ran alongside, laughing, their feet squelching in the mud. For them, the thaw was not only survival, but freedom. The chance to run and play outside after months trapped indoors. Even the poorest peasants felt a surge of relief in these days. Fresh greens like nettles and sorrel began to poke through the melting snow, adding something new to their winter-worn diet. Livestock, thin but alive, could soon be let out to pasture. The long gamble of survival was not yet won, but hope had returned. For nobles and kings, Plough Monday carried symbolic weight as well. Courts might host feasts where lords ceremonially struck the earth with a spade, affirming their role as stewards of the land. Minstrels sang verses welcoming the season, while the court toasted to fertility, fortune, and faith. The people knew that however harsh the winter, however great the losses, the earth would not stay barren forever. To us, the lengthening days of February may seem a small thing, a calendar inevitability. But to medieval folk who lived with their survival tethered to soil and sun, it was a revelation. The thaw was not merely seasonal change, it was resurrection, redemption, and proof that endurance had not been in vain. And so, with songs, ale, and the rhythmic cut of plows through thawing earth, medieval Europe turned its face once more toward the light. Winter was not defeated, it would come again. But for now, the people had survived, and the promise of spring stretched before them like green fields waiting to bloom. As the frost loosened its grip and green shoots pushed through the thawing soil, medieval folk could look back on winter not only as a season of suffering, but as a crucible that forged their resilience. Winter was more than cold weather. It was a test, a teacher, and a mirror of the human spirit. For peasants, the lesson was endurance. Each winter demanded careful planning. Grain stored away, firewood stacked high, clothing mended and patched until it could last another season. To falter in preparation was to invite death. Yet even the best laid plans could fail when famine struck or storms raged. Then came the second lesson, adaptability. People learned to survive on nettles, to patch roofs with mud, to share what they had when nothing remained to give. In these small acts, they demonstrated a truth that transcends centuries. Survival belongs not to the strongest alone, but to those who endure together. For nobles, the lesson was humility. Castles, though grand, were no refuge from frost seeping through stone or sickness carried in by servants. Wealth could cushion hunger but not erase it, and kings themselves shivered in their halls. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, according to one account, froze in her own chamber, her riches powerless against the cold. The message was stark. Winter spared no one, and status could not command the seasons. For the church, winter was a season of faith. Priests preached that cold and hunger were divine trials, meant to refine souls as fire purifies gold. The faithful knelt in icy chapels, their prayers rising in breath that frosted the air. Hope in God became the warmth that no hearth could give. Winter's trials deepened belief, for only faith promised that beyond suffering lay spring, both earthly and eternal. And for communities, the lesson was compassion. Survival was rarely solitary. Villages that shared food, firewood, and care for the sick stood stronger than those that fractured under strain. The feast of St. Stephen, with its charity and misrule, was more than celebration. It was practice for generosity, a reminder that joy and mercy were as vital as bread. Winter taught that to turn away from a neighbor was to invite ruin upon oneself. Even today, when our homes are warmed with central heating and our markets overflow in every season, the lessons of medieval winter endure. We grumble at slushy sidewalks, shiver at bus stops, or curse a delayed flight, but these are shadows compared to the long months our ancestors endured. Their trials remind us of how fragile and yet how resilient human beings can be. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of medieval winter, the recognition that hardship need not crush the spirit. From hovels thick with smoke to castles echoing with coughs, people endured not by comfort but by courage. They told stories, sang songs, shared bread, and clung fiercely to hope. Each winter survived was a triumph, not of wealth or power, but of the human will to live. So the next time the cold seeps into your bones, remember them. Remember the peasants huddled in hovels, the lords shivering in their halls, the monks tending the sick by candlelight. Remember that their strength is part of our inheritance, a flame carried down through centuries. Winter may always come, but so too does spring, and in between, it is resilience that keeps us alive. The story of winter in the Middle Ages is, at its heart, the story of human endurance. It is easy, from our modern vantage point of heated homes, stocked supermarkets, and electric light, to look back with pity or disbelief. How did they survive the bone-deep cold, the gnawing hunger, the endless dark? And yet they did. Year after year, century upon century, they endured, and in their endurance lies a lesson for us all. Theirs was a world where every season demanded respect. Winter was not an inconvenience but a foe, one that shaped societies and tempered spirits. It humbled kings in their castles and tested peasants in their hovels. It demanded planning, sacrifice, faith, and above all, solidarity. And though countless lives were lost to famine, disease, and cold, countless more pressed on, shouldering the weight of hardship so that spring might come again. What strikes us most is not only the suffering, but the light that persisted amid it, the laughter around a midwinter feast, the joy of children skating on frozen ponds, the quiet prayers whispered in smoky chapels, the small acts of kindness, sharing a cloak, delivering a log of firewood, offering a bowl of pottage. These are not the grand victories of history, but the quiet ones, the victories of compassion and willpower, of choosing hope over despair when the world itself seemed frozen still. When we feel the chill of modern winters, we might recall those who came before us, our ancestors, who lived without electricity, without medicine, without the abundance we take for granted. Their lives remind us that hardship is not new, that survival has always been a dance between endurance and community. And perhaps, in their struggle, we can find strength for our own trials, whatever form they may take. So let us honor their resilience. Let us remember the peasants who counted each grain of wheat, the nobles who shivered beneath furs, the monks who cared for the dying, the mothers who rocked feverish children through the long nights, and the fathers who trudged into the snow for one more bundle of wood. They lived through winters we can scarcely imagine, and they left us a legacy of perseverance. And as we drift toward the warmth of our own hearths, let us carry that legacy within us. For if they could endure the endless nights of medieval winters, then surely we too can weather our own seasons of trial. Winter, after all, always gives way. The frost melts, the soil softens, the fields green again. Spring comes, not once but always. And that truth, known by medieval folk as surely as we know it now, is perhaps the greatest comfort of all. Thank you for journeying through this story of hardship and resilience. May it remind you, the next time cold winds rattle your window panes, that within the human spirit lies a warmth no winter can extinguish.